Welcome back to Whispers in the Dark. Settle in, lower the lights, and step carefully into a forest that once knew innocence. This is not the gentle tale you remember. This is a story of grief that rotted into hunger, of a creature shaped by love and broken by gunfire, of antlers slick with blood beneath a moon that never seemed to set. If you enjoy dark retellings and dreadful woodland horror, stay with me until the very end. Now let's begin. In the first bright days of his life, Bambi knew only softness. The forest that raised him seemed made by a patient and loving hand. Morning mist drifted low over the fern beds in pale ribbons. Dew collected on the velvet lips of wild roses and hung like glass beads from thin spider silk stretched between roots and saplings. The earth smelled rich and damp and alive, full of crushed moss, leaf rot, mushrooms, and rain-soaked bark. Sunlight came down through the high branches in golden shafts that turned floating pollen into dust of light. When the wind moved through the crowns of the pines, it whispered in 1,000 needles. When it traveled through the birches, it sounded like dry breath against old paper. Streams hurried over stones polished smooth by ages of water, and every pool reflected an upside-down world of green fire and silver cloud. Bambi grew in the center of that living cathedral beside his mother. She was slender and graceful, with a coat the color of wet chestnut bark, and dark eyes so deep and glossy they seemed to gather the forest inside them. Her nose was always cool when she nudged him. Her touch was careful even when she corrected him, guiding him away from thorn thickets and sinkholes hidden beneath dead leaves, teaching him the language of the woods through scent, sound, silence, and stillness. She showed him where clover grew sweetest in shadowed clearings, and where foxes liked to creep at dusk. She taught him which mushrooms glowed faintly at night, and which plants carried poison in their roots. She showed him how to freeze when crows erupted all at once, because that meant something beneath them was moving with purpose. To Bambi, she was warmth, safety, and home. When he was very young, he would stumble after her through curtains of fern, all long legs and uncertain balance, his hooves clicking against exposed roots. He slept tucked against her side, while fireflies drifted above them like embers. He woke to the slow rise and fall of her breathing, to the steady beat of her heart beneath her ribs, to the comforting smell of her fur and crushed grass. Sometimes she would groom him with quick, gentle motions, and he would close his eyes while the world beyond her body disappeared. Those were his first memories, and perhaps his happiest. A world where danger was only a lesson, where shadows had not yet learned his name. The other animals watched them with fondness. The rabbits often fed nearby, their ears twitching at every crackle in the brush. Jays swooped overhead, vulgar and loud, but oddly protective, raising alarms at the first sign of anything strange. An old owl regarded the pair from the hollow of an ancient oak with enormous amber eyes that never seemed to blink. Foxes kept their distance. Badgers ignored everyone. The pond frogs sang after sundown in throats full of mud and music. Once, during a warm afternoon, Bambi stood on uncertain legs beside the stream and stared at his own reflection while his mother drank. He saw wide eyes, a small muzzle, white spots across his back like dropped petals, and absurdly large ears. His mother lifted her head with water shining from her chin and pressed her nose to the top of his head. "You are part of this place," she seemed to tell him without words. "It knows you." For a time, that was true. Spring became summer. Summer thickened into a lush green world humming with insects. The air turned sweet with flowers, heavy with heat. Bambi grew surer on his legs. He began to leap over fallen logs for the sheer joy of it. He chased butterflies and startled at his own courage when he splashed into shallow water. His mother watched with a soft patience that carried pride within it, though her ears always worked, turning, listening. At times, she would pause in the middle of grazing and lift her head high, nostrils opening, body gone rigid with sudden alertness. Bambi learned then to be still. Nothing would happen. A minute later, she would relax, and the day would continue. Yet the lesson stayed in him. There was danger in the world, but danger remained distant, abstract, a rustle, a smell, a warning. Then came autumn. The forest began to burn in colors before it ever burned in blood. Leaves yellowed, then blazed amber, red, and copper. The ground grew thick with them. Every step released the smell of tannin and damp wood. Wind sharpened. Nights lengthened. The sky lost its softness and turned cold and hard above the branches. Mushrooms fattened in rotten logs. The pond shrank at the edges and reflected thin strips of iron-gray cloud. Bambi's baby spots faded. His legs strengthened. Tiny nubs began to press at his brow. One afternoon, his mother led him to a meadow beyond the denser part of the woods, to a place where grass still grew high and tender in the slanting golden light. It was a beautiful place, open and quiet, ringed by skeletal trees. The field rolled gently downward, and on its edges stood blackberry tangles stripped almost bare. The air held the smell of cold earth and something distant Bambi did not know. His mother knew it. He saw the change in her at once. Her body became taut. Her ears thrust forward. Her eyes widened until the whites barely flashed. She lowered her head and motioned for him to keep close. Bambi obeyed, though he did not understand. They stepped softly into the grass. Each blade brushed his legs with a papery hiss. A crow called once and then fell silent. The silence deepened. It was not the natural hush of waiting animals. It was an absence, a swallowed sound. Even the wind seemed to hold itself back. His mother suddenly froze. Bambi lifted his head. He smelled metal, smoke, sweat, a strange bitter scent like broken stones and old fire. He saw nothing but grass, trees, the sinking sun. Then the world exploded. The crack of the gunshot split the meadow apart. Birds burst upward from the trees in a black storm. Bambi flinched so violently he nearly collapsed. For half a heartbeat, he could not understand what had happened. his mother screamed. It was not a cry he had ever heard from any creature. It tore through the field in one long, ragged burst of agony that seemed to peel the sky open. Her front legs buckled. Blood sprayed from her chest in a hot fan across the grass and across Bambi's face. It struck him wet and startlingly warm. He smelled iron so strong it clogged his throat. She staggered sideways, shrieking again, a raw, splintering sound, and half fell, half ran, her hooves gouging the earth. Another shot cracked through the trees. It hit her shoulder. Bones snapped with a sound like thick branches breaking. Flesh burst. Bambi saw a red ruin open beneath her hide. Her leg hung wrong, dangling, skin and tendon keeping it attached, while bright arterial blood pulsed down her side in rhythmic bursts. She tried to reach him anyway. Even then, even as her body came apart, she dragged herself toward him through the grass, leaving a streak of blood and torn clover behind her, her mouth open in gasping cries, her eyes fixed on his. Run, she would have said, if pain had left room for words. Bambi could not move. His body had become a prison of terror. Every muscle locked. Every breath came jagged and useless. He stared as she collapsed fully onto her side. Her legs thrashed. One hoof beat frantically against the ground, kicking leaves and dirt into the air. Pink foam bubbled at her mouth. Blood poured from the wound in her chest and soaked the earth beneath her until the meadow floor turned black and slick. Her scream weakened into a wet, choking rasp. The grass behind her shifted. A man stepped from the trees. He was massive to Bambi's eyes, upright and unnatural, wrapped in rough cloth stained with mud. His boots crushed frost-stiff stems with dull thuds. In his hands was the long black shape that had spoken thunder. His face was broad, unshaven, red from the cold. White steam puffed from his mouth. He smelled of oil, tobacco, old leather, and death. His eyes fell first on the doe writhing in the grass, then on the fawn beside her. For a heartbeat, Bambi thought the man might stop. The hunter raised the gun. Bambi's mother found one last broken reserve of strength. With a gasp that sounded like the forest itself trying to breathe through a punctured lung, she lurched upward and shoved her head against Bambi's side. He stumbled. The gun fired. Bark exploded from a tree behind him. Something hot tore across his flank without fully entering. The pain came a second later, sharp and white. Then instinct finally broke through his shock. He ran. He fled through the grass while behind him his mother screamed one final time. That sound followed him. It chased him through brambles and over logs, through cold streams and fern beds, through shadows and gathering dusk. It was high and ragged at first, then lower, more desperate, bubbling with blood. Then it cut off all at once. The silence after it was worse. Bambi ran until his legs trembled and failed. He collapsed in a hollow beneath a tangle of roots where wet leaves clung to his sides, and his own heart hammered so hard it made the ground seem to pulse. The shallow furrow across his flank burned. Blood from his mother had dried on his face, stiffening the fur around his eyes and mouth. He could smell her everywhere. In his nostrils, in the back of his throat, on his skin. He licked his lips and tasted salt and iron. Night fell. He waited for her. He listened for the careful step he knew better than his own breathing. He listened for the soft chuff she made when returning from scouting. He listened until the stars hardened overhead and frost crept silver along the roots around him. He listened until dawn came gray and raw. She did not return. By the second day, hunger dragged him from hiding. He crept through the forest in panic, searching every path they had walked together. He went to the stream. He went to the fern glade. He went to the hidden dip where they had once slept under a fallen cedar. No sign, no scent except the old fatting comfort of her trails and the new sickening intrusion of blood, men, and smoke lingering on the wind. By the third day, he found the meadow again. The crows found it before he did. They rose from the grass as he approached, black wings beating, beaks shining wet. The smell reached him first. Rot beginning, entrails, cold meat open to air. He pushed through the flattened grass and saw what remained. Mother lay on her side where she had fallen, but she was no longer whole. The hunter had taken from her. Her belly had been cut open from sternum to hip. The hide had been peeled back in broad sections, exposing yellow fat, stringy muscle, purple organs, and white ribs slick with drying blood. One hind leg was gone entirely. Much of her neck had been hacked apart. The cavity of her chest gaped open. Flies seethed in it despite the chill. One eye had been eaten away, leaving a dark, collapsed socket. The other remained, clouded and fixed. Bambi stood beside her and did not understand. This could not be the shape of a mother. This could not be the vessel that had held warmth, milk, voice, touch. He lowered his head and nudged her neck. Cold, stiff. The skin gave strangely where it had been cut. He pressed harder, desperate. A ribbon of loosened tissue slid from the open chest and slapped wetly against the ground. He leaped back in terror. The crows watched from the branches. One hopped down and pecked at the exposed edge of her mouth. Bambi lunged wildly, and it flapped away, cawing. He remained there until dusk. When darkness gathered, he curled beside what was left of her, nose tucked against the ragged fur that had not yet been taken. Every smell of her was contaminated by blood, offal, and the sour beginnings of decay. Yet he stayed. Through the night, scavengers came near. He heard them shifting in the grass, testing the air. Teeth clicked. Low growls murmured. Bambi rose and drove them off with panicked kicks and frantic charges. He stood over her until sunrise with red dried beneath his hooves. Something changed in him, in that meadow. Grief was too small a word for it. Grief suggested softness, longing, tears. What entered Bambi was a colder thing. It took shape where his fear had lived. It settled into the bones of his face, the arch of his back, the set of his jaw. It grew around the memory of the gunshot and his mother's scream until that memory became not a wound but a seed. Winter came early that year. Snow laid a white hush over the forest, but the hush was false. Bambi was alone. He should not have survived it, yet he did. Hunger sharpened him. Sorrow hardened him. He learned every hidden path, every lean-to of cedar that blocked the wind, every place where bark could be stripped and bitter roots clawed from frozen soil. He learned where foxes denned and where wolves passed. He learned the human scent trails too, where they entered the forest, where they returned, what metal smelled like, what boots smelled like, what blood smelled like when it belonged to deer, rabbits, birds, or men. As he grew, the forest grew strange around him. Animals avoided him in ways they did not avoid other deer. There was a stillness in him that felt wrong. While young bucks played and tested themselves with harmless shoving, Bambi watched from a distance with eyes older than his body. He stood alone in shadow. His antlers came in narrow at first, then broader with each passing season, branching into a crown of tines sharp enough to puncture bark. He rubbed them against trunks until pale wood showed beneath the scars. Sometimes he did it for practice. Sometimes he did it until his forehead bled. He dreamed of the meadow. In dreams, the gunshot never ended. It echoed and echoed while his mother dragged herself toward him forever, chest blooming red, mouth open in one long, terrible scream. Sometimes in the dream she reached him. Sometimes she pressed her muzzle to his and opened her mouth, and instead of a voice, blood poured out in a black torrent full of writhing crows. He would wake with foam on his lips. Years passed. The forest around his chosen territory grew thick and old. Storms toppled trees into one another, creating walls of splintered trunks and thorn. A marsh spread into one low area, sour and bubbling, where the mud could suck a hoof down to the knee. Pines leaned close over the northern ridge, their branches knitting out the moonlight. In the center of it all lay the meadow where his mother died. No deer grazed there now. Grass grew tall but sparse, and in autumn it took on the color of dried blood. The soil remained darker than it should have been, as though something had soaked into it too deeply to ever wash away. That place became his. No creature crossed it without his noticing. At first, he drove intruders away as any stag might. He lowered his head, displayed his antlers, stamped, charged. But ordinary warning was never enough for the rage inside him. It had waited too long. It needed shape. It needed victims. The first killing happened in spring. A young buck wandered into the meadow at dawn, lean from winter and dazzled by the fresh shoots pushing through damp earth. Mist swirled around his legs. Birds had just begun the fragile first songs of morning. He did not see Bambi standing in the trees, utterly still. Bambi came out without sound. Other buck turned too late. Bambi hit him in the ribs with such force that both of them slid through mud and crushed flowers. Antlers punched into flesh. The buck screamed. Not the scream of Bambi's mother, not even close, but something in the sound struck the same iron string inside him. Bambi drove harder. One tine slipped between ribs and entered the lung. He felt the resistance give, then the wet collapse beyond it. Hot blood flooded over his brow and into his eyes. The buck kicked frantically. Bambi ripped sideways, opening a long tear from chest to flank. Loops of glistening intestine bulged through the wound and spilled into the grass in steaming coils. The buck tried to rise. Bambi slammed him down again, trampling his foreleg until bone jutted pale through skin. He stabbed downward once, twice again, shredding throat, shoulder, chest. The air filled with bright arterial spray and the thick smell of opened insides. When the young buck finally stopped convulsing, his body looked less killed than dismantled. Bambi stood over him panting, chest heaving, legs trembling. The world around him was shockingly beautiful. Sunlight broke through the mist. A woodpecker hammered somewhere far away. Droplets of blood jeweled the grass tips and shone like rubies. Inside Bambi, there was no peace, only a brief thinning of the pressure. A momentary silence where the scream in his memory faded to a whisper. He left the carcass for scavengers and watched them come. Crows first, then foxes, then night things with yellow eyes and needle teeth. He watched them tear flesh free in strips, watched ribs emerge clean and shining, watched the earth drink whatever leaked away. The sight did not sicken him. It steadied him. After that, killing became language. Any buck bold enough to test his borders died badly. Some he disemboweled with a sideways rake of his antlers. Some he pinned and crushed under his hooves until their skulls split against stones. Once he drove a rival into the marsh and held him there, antlers hooked under the jaw, while the mud swallowed the panicked animal inch by inch. Bubbles rose around the deer's muzzle as he suffocated. His eyes rolled white. His legs thrashed slower and slower until only his antlers remained above the surface like the roots of a drowned tree. Bambi watched until even those slipped under. But deer were not enough. He learned the scent of men too well to leave it be. The first human who entered his territory after he came fully into his strength was a trapper in late autumn, a narrow-shouldered man moving carefully along the ridge with coils of wire and a hatchet at his belt. Rain had fallen all day, turning leaves slick and making the world smell raw and metallic. The man paused often to inspect tracks. He did not know that every time he stopped, something stopped with him in the dark beyond the birches. Bambi followed for nearly an hour. He moved like shadow between trunks, antlers weaving through branches, hooves placing with impossible care for something so large. Rain beaded on his hide. Water dripped from the points of his antlers like clear blood. The man finally crouched beside a game trail to set a snare. That was when Bambi charged. The impact lifted the trapper off the ground. Antlers hit low in the back and tore through the belly. The man made a short, shocked sound as one tine burst from beneath his ribs in the front, slick and red. Bambi shook his head. The body whipped sideways. Skin split open from spine to stomach with a tearing wet crack. A gush of steaming entrails poured out into the rain-soaked leaves. The man was still alive. He clawed at the ground, trying to drag himself forward even while his insides slipped behind him in glistening ropes. His mouth opened and closed around wordless cries. Bambi came around in front of him and looked into his face. Mud streaked the man's cheeks. Rain washed pink rivulets from his hairline. Fear widened his eyes until they looked almost animal. Then Bambi brought both front hooves down on the back of the man's skull. Bone collapsed. Teeth burst from the mouth and scattered into leaves. One eye bulged loose from the socket, attached by a wet cord, then ruptured under the second strike. Gray and red matter spread beneath the ruined head. The body twitched and lay still. Bambi remained there as rain erased the tracks of the struggle. Blood diluted and ran into the roots. Crows began to gather overhead, black against the dim white sky. He was seen after that, at first only in fragments. Hunters spoke in low voices in cabins and by fires. Something big in the northern tract. A stag too bold. A stag that did not flee. A stag found standing near mangled carcasses long after wolves would have scattered. A stag with antlers like hooks. A stag with pale scars across his flank. Then the stories worsened. Trappers missing. Dogs returning disemboweled. Horses panicking at the scent of something unseen in the trees. A boy claiming he had glimpsed a deer standing motionless outside his window at midnight. Its face pointed toward the glass, eyes reflecting not moonlight, but a dull red glimmer from the hearth inside. People laughed at first, then winter delivered proof. 2 brothers came into the woods after a storm to hunt late-season deer. Snow still clung in crusted patches to the ground and coated the lower pine branches. The air was so cold each breath felt like a blade behind the nose. They walked together at dawn with rifles slung over heavy coats, joking softly, their voices muffled by scarves. One was broad and bearded. The other was younger, pink-cheeked, eager, still carrying the posture of someone who believed the woods existed for him. Bambi watched them from the crest, above the meadow. Snow softened sound, but it also marked movement. He saw every print they left. He smelled oil from the guns, stale sweat from wool, tobacco, and the remembered ghost of the man who had killed his mother in every similar scent. When the brothers separated to circle opposite ends of the field, Bambi waited. Patience had become one of his deadliest organs. The younger brother passed near a thicket of hawthorn where wind had collected old leaves. He held his rifle half raised, eyes scanning the open grass. Bambi came out of the thicket so suddenly that the boy fired by reflex. The shot grazed an antler, spraying splinters of bone and bark from the trunk behind. Before he could cycle the weapon, Bambi drove into him. A tine entered just beneath the jaw and punched through the soft roof of the mouth. It emerged from the cheek in a spray of broken teeth and blood. Another pierced the collarbone and snagged deep in the lung. The brother screamed, but the scream came out bubbling and wet because his tongue had been skewered. Bambi lifted him. The body thrashed, boots kicking empty air, hands clawing uselessly at antlers buried in flesh. Blood ran down Bambi's face in sheets. Then Bambi slammed him against a tree. Once, twice, a third time hard enough to split the skull. The back of the head burst against bark, smearing dark clots and pale fragments. One arm bent backward with a loud crack, elbow reversed. The rifle dropped into snow. The boy slid from the antlers in pieces of himself, leaving strips of coat and skin behind, and crumpled at the tree's base in a red heap that twitched only once. The older brother came running at the sound. He saw Bambi standing over the wreckage of the younger man and froze. Snow fell softly around them. For one impossible second, neither moved. Then the older brother raised his rifle with shaking hands. Bambi was faster. He did not charge straight. He cut left, vanished behind a trunk, then lunged from the side. The shot went wild. Bambi's antlers caught the man in the ribs and spun him around. He went down hard with the breath driven from him. Before he could rise, Bambi stomped on his chest. Ribs caved inward. A jagged shard punched through the coat from the inside near the sternum. The man shrieked. Bambi struck again, crushing the pelvis. The sound was a thick, grinding pop, followed by a howl of pain, so high it scarcely sounded human. The man dragged himself through the snow with his forearms, legs dead behind him, leaving a broad red trail beneath his shattered hips. He reached for the dropped rifle. Bambi planted a hoof on his hand and pushed. Bones in the wrist burst through the skin like snapped ivory. Fingers flattened. The man choked on his own scream. Bambi lowered his face close to the man. Steam rose from both of them. The man's beard was stiff with blood. His eyes darted frantically, searching for reason, mercy, anything. Bambi saw only another upright shape with thunder in its hands. He drove an antler down through the back of the neck. The tine entered between vertebrae and exited through the throat in a gush that painted the snow black red. The body spasmed. Blood pumped in diminishing bursts. Then the forest fell quiet again, except for the whisper of falling snow. By spring, the story of the stag had escaped the forest and gone into nearby towns. They called him names. The Red Crown, the Widow Maker, the Devil Deer. Some swore he was no animal, but a curse born from old cruelty. Others said he was simply a wounded beast that had learned hate. Men organized hunts to find him. They came with rifles, hounds, lanterns, ropes, even a preacher once, who stood at the tree line and prayed loudly into the wind as if the woods could be exorcised. The woods answered in corpses. One hunter was found hanging in the fork of an ash tree with his abdomen torn open, entrails hanging down like obscene garlands swaying in the breeze. His hounds lay below with their throats ripped out, tracheas gnawed open, eyes pecked by birds. Another man staggered out of the forest after 3 days without his lower jaw, which had been ripped free from the hinge. He tried to tell what happened, but all that came from the red cave of his mouth were bubbling moans before he bled to death on a kitchen floor. A third was discovered in summer near the marsh, sunk to the chest in black mud, face eaten by insects, one arm reaching upward as if he had clawed for help until the very end. Antler punctures riddled his torso. The flesh around them was swollen green and split with rot. The more they hunted Bambi, the more monstrous he became. Seasons thickened over him. His body broadened. Scars crossed his hide in white ropes from bullets, briars, and battles. One ear was torn nearly in half. His antlers grew vast and asymmetrical, one side branching like dead lightning, the other curving cruelly forward. Moss sometimes clung to them after rain. In dim light, he looked less like an animal than a piece of the forest itself, a moving structure of wood, muscle, and old rage. His eyes seemed almost black by day, but at dusk they caught light strangely, holding it in a red copper gleam that unnerved anything that met them. And always he kept the meadow. No birds nested there. No rabbits crossed it. Even wolves skirted its edges. In the hottest weeks of summer, the ground in its center gave off an odor of old blood when rain struck it. Sometimes on still nights, when fog gathered low and white over the grass, those living nearby claimed they could hear a deer crying from deep within the woods. Not the voice of a deer, not quite. A drawn-out human-like scream of agony that rose and broke and rose again. Those who followed it did not return. One autumn evening, many years after his mother died, a little girl wandered from a logging camp at the southern edge of the forest. She was no more than 8, wrapped in a red shawl too thin for the cold, chasing the idea of fireflies she had seen the night before. By the time her father noticed she was gone, dusk had already deepened. Men took lanterns and called her name among the trees. Bambi found her first. She had stumbled into the meadow and sat crying beside a clump of dead grass. Her cheeks shone with tears. Her little boots were muddy. When Bambi emerged from the fog, she looked up, saw the stag, and went very still. Perhaps she saw something gentle in him for one impossible instant. Some old story shape. Some memory passed down in books and pictures of a deer with wide, innocent eyes. She reached out a small hand. Bambi stopped only a few feet away. Her scent was milk, wool, smoke, and fear. Behind that, on the wind, came the unmistakable smell of men from the searchers moving closer. He lowered his head. The child smiled through her tears. Then voices sounded beyond the trees. Lantern light flickered between trunks. Men calling. Branches snapping. Bambi's muscles tightened. The old scream inside him woke all at once. Full volume, full horror, full memory. The child's hand touched the bloody scar across his muzzle. He jerked back as if burned. For a terrible moment, his body shook with conflict so intense it seemed it might split him. The meadow, the blood, the voices, the shawl red as opened flesh, his mother dying, the hunter stepping from the trees, the child before him. One of the men shouted. Another yelled that he saw her. The girl turned toward the sound. Bambi moved. He did not gore her. Instead, he struck the ground beside her with both front hooves, forcing her backward into the grass, then wheeled and charged the lantern light. The first logger barely had time to raise his axe. Bambi hit him in the stomach and opened him from navel to spine. A sack of intestines spilled steaming into his hands as he folded around the antlers. The second man swung a pole and shattered it against Bambi's shoulder. Bambi trampled his knee into fragments, then tore his throat out with a sideways rake that left the head hanging by a flap of flesh. The third ran. Bambi pursued him through the dark underbrush, where lantern light bobbed wildly and vanished. The man fell over a root and screamed for help. Bambi found him in seconds. By the time the others reached the sound, there was no man left to save, only a torso with the chest cavity opened and the heart dragged several feet away into leaves. The little girl survived. She was found at the edge of the meadow at dawn, mute with shock, wrapped in mist. She never again spoke above a whisper, and when asked what happened in the woods, she would say only that the sad deer saved her from the bad men. No one believed her. Yet the search party had indeed been made up of rough loggers, drunk and cruel, who had beaten her father and meant to take the child to force him into surrendering a tract of timber rights. In the dark, intentions had shifted. Violence had bloomed, and Bambi, broken though he was, had chosen where to put his antlers. That did not redeem him. Monsters are not undone by one mercy. Years later, an old hunter came into the forest alone with a rifle older than most trees at the camp edge. His beard was white. His back was bent. One side of his face bore a deep, puckered scar. He moved slowly, as though guided by memory more than strength. Bambi smelled him from a great distance and followed. There was something familiar in the man's odor beneath age and sickness. Tobacco, oil, leather, and beneath it all, buried like a corpse in peat, the faded trace of the meadow long ago. Recognition spread through Bambi, not as thought, but as total body certainty. This was him. The hunter who killed his mother had grown old. Even then he came armed. Even then he stepped into the meadow without reverence, scanning the grass, breath misting in the cold. Evening bled slowly across the sky. The first stars pricked through the deepening blue. Bambi stood at the far edge of the field between two birches and watched the man who had made him. The hunter saw him and smiled. It was not a joyful smile. It was something cracked and exhausted, as if he had spent years expecting this meeting and was almost relieved it had arrived. He raised the rifle, hands trembling with age, but he did not fire at once. His mouth moved. Perhaps he said sorry. Perhaps he said finally. The wind took the words. Bambi advanced. The hunter fired. The bullet punched into Bambi's shoulder, deep, but not enough. Pain flashed hot, then vanished under greater force. Bambi kept coming. The hunter tried to reload, but arthritic fingers fumbled the cartridge. He dropped it into the grass. Bambi hit him. Antlers entered the old man's belly low and rose through him. The impact lifted him clear off the ground. His rifle spun away. Blood spilled from his mouth in a dark ribbon. Bambi held him there, eye to eye, suspended. The hunter's breath rattled. His hands grasped weakly at the antlers protruding from his own body. Bambi remembered his mother, dragging herself through blood. He remembered her open chest, her torn shoulder, her eye clouded under crows. Very slowly, with deliberate force, Bambi lowered his head and rolled the hunter off the tines onto the ground. The old man lay on his back, intestines swelling from the wound, trying to breathe around blood filling his throat. He made a faint, mewling sound. One hand pressed futilely at the ruin of his abdomen, while the other reached toward where the rifle had fallen. Bambi stepped on that hand. Bones cracked. Then Bambi did what he had never done before. He began not merely to kill, but to ruin. He stamped the old man's legs until both femurs punched through the skin. He tore open the chest with his antlers, ripping ribs apart one by one until the cavity opened wet and shining beneath the twilight. He hooked the jaw and snapped it sideways from the skull. He drove a tine through one eye and twisted until the socket burst in a gush. The old man's cries dissolved into choking gurgles, then into breathless spasms. Still Bambi continued. He opened the belly wider and dragged the steaming loops of intestine across the grass, spreading them like roots. He split the throat so deeply the spine showed white at the center. At last, he planted one hoof on the sternum, another on the ruined pelvis, and pulled with his antlers until the body gave way in a long, tearing rip that sprayed hot blood across his chest and face. Silence returned. The hunter lay in pieces beneath the rising moon. Bambi stood over him, shaking, blood dripping from every tine. He had waited his whole life for this. Every season since the meadow, every nightmare, every corpse, every charge through snow and mud and darkness. Yet, as he stared down at the shredded remains of the man, he felt no release. His mother was still dead. The field was still haunted. The scream was still inside him. He lifted his head to the moon and made a sound no deer should ever make. It started as a horse bellow, deep and raw. It climbed into a high, wavering scream that was almost hers, almost human, almost something older than either. It rolled through the trees and across the marsh and over the distant roofs of sleeping houses. Dogs woke barking. Bobbies cried in their cradles. Men who had never entered the northern woods sat bolt upright in bed, with their hearts racing for reasons they could not name. The next morning, the old hunter's remains were found by 3 younger men sent from town after he failed to return. 2 of them went mad before noon. One vomited until his throat tore. Another clawed his own face bloody, trying to gouge away the sight of the body spread across the meadow like butchered offerings. The 3rd man stumbled back to town and swore he had seen the stag watching from the tree line, half hidden by shadow, motionless except for blood dripping from his antlers in slow, dark threads. No one hunted the meadow after that. Years piled up. Camps were abandoned. Trails disappeared beneath nettles and saplings. Cabins collapsed inward under rot and snow. Stories became warnings. Warnings became legends. And legends became the sort of thing old people lowered their voices to tell when wind worried at the windows after dark. Still Bambi lived. He aged, but not like ordinary creatures. Age seemed only to hollow him into something more severe. His hide darkened. His ribs showed in winter like the slats of a ruined barrel. One antler broke and regrew stranger. His scars layered until his skin seemed stitched from many lives. He moved slower in the coldest months, yet even then none dared cross his ground. Carrion birds knew him. Foxes watched him from a distance. Once in a while, some desperate animal or foolish man wandered too far in, and the old red work began again among the grass. Those who claim monsters are born wrong have never looked closely at what grief can do when it is left alone in the wild. The forest remembers everything. Blood in the soil, bone under roots, fear passed in scent from one generation to the next. Somewhere beneath every layer of leaf mold and snow in that meadow remains the first hot spray from a mother's chest, the place where a child stood frozen while love was shot apart in front of him. Perhaps that is why nothing healthy ever grew there again. Perhaps that is why fog collects too thickly over that field. Perhaps that is why, if you stand at its edge after sundown, you may hear a deer screaming and a deeper sound moving toward you through the grass. And if the trees part, you may see him, not the sweet fawn from old illustrations, not the harmless prince of birdsong and spring. You may see instead a towering stag with a coat blackened by wet and age, with scars crossing his body like old lightning, with antlers jagged as hooked knives, with eyes reflecting a dull ember red from no visible fire. You may smell old blood before you understand what it is. You may notice bones half sunk in the earth around the meadow's edge, some human, some not, cleaned by weather, split by hooves. If he looks at you, do not mistake the stillness for peace. In that skull lives the echo of a gunshot that never stopped ringing. In that heart lives a scream that was never answered. And in that territory, all trespass ends the same way. Flesh opened, blood spilled hot into cold grass, the forest feeding on what grief has made of one once gentle creature. So if you ever lose your path in deep woods and find yourself stepping into a clearing where the soil is darker than it should be, where no birds sing, where fog curls low like breath from a wound, turn back at once. Do not call out. Do not run unless he charges. And if you hear hooves circling just beyond sight, understand that the forest has already chosen whether to keep you. This was the story of Bambi, as the dark might tell it. A child of beauty turned into a sovereign of horror by one shattering act of cruelty. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you for listening. Please like the video and subscribe for more. Good night.
whispers of a love so true, painting dreams of me and you. And I'll hold you close in this moment.